if everything is not broken. I've had a few conversations with bad audio that didn't work, so I always want to test it first.
Sure.
How is the sound? Question mark. Oh, yeah, especially with this new YouTube thing where they're the kid friendly policy or whatever. Added a whole bunch of new settings you have to deal with. All right, it looks like we're live. So, Tremper, thanks for coming on. Thanks for being willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, Tom. So let's see. I am a retired professor of Old Testament, though I still lecture a lot and write a lot. And I got interested in the Old Testament in college. I went to seminary, then went to Yale to get a doctorate in ancient Near Eastern languages and literature. And then I taught for the next 40 years and as a professor at an institution. Married to Alice and have 3 sons and 6 granddaughters.
So, that's exciting.
Yeah.
What is your position on the Old Testament in general? How much of it do you think is historical versus fictional?
Well, that's a good question and not easy to answer by percentage or even simply say this is historical and that's not when we're thinking in modernist terms. But I do think that there is a historical background to Genesis through Esther, though it's often told in a highly literary and theological way. The theology shapes it. I'd want to kind of talk about how the different parts of it do reflect history, because I think Genesis 1 to 11, for instance, from the creation to the Tower of Babel, is not giving us kind of a straightforward historical description as much as using highly figurative language to tell us about things that actually happened. I do think God created the world, though I don't think he did it in 6 24-hour days and then rested on the 7th day. I don't think he literally picked up dust from the ground and breathed in it. In other words, if you read it in its ancient setting and you read it according to the way that I think it was intended to be read, you would understand that, or not to press that to find out how God created creation. So I've done a lot of writing on that subject. I do a lot on science faith issues with groups like the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, which has a dialogue on science, ethics, and religion section, and with a group called the BioLogos Foundation. So, in any case, that's another subject. But
Yep.
So I do think, for instance, in the conquest narratives, Joshua 1 to 11, again, if you read it in its ancient setting, I think there's a lot of hyperbole there. In a battle accounts, but I do think battles happened, and
I agree. I think battles did happen in the past.
Yeah, I know. So, well, there are a lot of people who think that those battles didn't happen, but that's another subject as well. But
so, how do you get to the conclusion that Esther is the starting point for there's like a more historical grounding for her being existing?
No, Esther is kind of the end point.
The end point, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, for instance, the genre signals that I pick up starting at Genesis 12 shows more concern for talking about events that happened in space and time and using much less obviously figurative language. And actually, when you get to Esther, I think Esther, it has a historical background to it, but I also think it's one of the most highly literary presentations of a historical event. And there are a lot of legitimate questions to be raised about, Esther's historicity. So, so again, there's a really good book for those who are interested, written by a close friend of mine and sometimes collaborator, B. Phillips Long, called The Art of Biblical History, where he points out that, first of all, this is true of all history, whether you're reading a book about the American Revolution or the Civil War, they're highly selective accounts, and they are shaped to present a particular perspective on the event. They're right and wrong perspectives, by the way. I mean, I would argue once I was doing work in Charleston, and my family had 2 tours of Charleston, one by the Daughters of the Confederacy, sponsored by that, and one by they were so upset about that presentation that the next day they signed up to take a tour of Charleston by former slaves, and they got, descendants of former slaves, and they got 2 significantly different perspectives on slavery in the city of Charleston. And I would argue probably the latter was much closer to reality than the rosy picture presented by the first group.
For sure.
So, yeah.
Well, that would be the big question, is how do we differentiate between which ones are the reality and which ones are the fiction, especially in a historical context?
Yeah, it's not easy. As I say, when it comes to the Bible, the first question is, what are the biblical authors intending? And to do that, you have to ask questions of genre, and you have to ask questions of genre within that ancient setting. So to really dig deep, I think you do need to know something about ancient Near Eastern historiography. And that, on the other hand, that doesn't mean that all of us, those of us who have PhDs in ancient Near Eastern studies, all agree on this either. So I don't want to give the impression that these are obvious and clear answers. And that's why I think we can have civil discussions and debates about them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So from my perspective, I would ask something like, is the intention of the authors really the key point that we should be looking at, or something? Because I would focus more on, is there archaeological confirmation of what they're saying?
Yeah. No, sorry. I'm glad you said that, because I meant to follow up with my first statement with the second statement, which means, even if the author intends it to be historical, that doesn't mean it's historical, right? And so there's still room for discussion about that. And that's when archaeology gets involved. However, archaeology itself is a highly interpretive topic. I've never been an archaeologist myself, though I've taken 2 post-PhD classes in archaeology with a couple of the most foremost archaeologists. And I came away from those times, and this was their intention, realizing just how interpretive archaeology is too. A lot of people get the misimpression that archaeology is some kind of science that can either prove or disprove the Bible. And it's not in the business of doing that. On the other hand, you can make arguments based on, you can make an argument that the archaeology is less favorable or more favorable to the biblical account. But there are even debates about among archaeologists themselves whether you should do archaeology completely devoid of all textual resources, and not just the Bible, but say ancient Near Eastern accounts from Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, or whatever.
Extra biblical.
Or you use them kind of in a kind of dialogue. But my bottom line, at least so far, is arguments that use archaeology to either prove the Bible, where there are a lot of people that say, this archaeology proves the historicity of the Bible. And I don't have to read much further to realize this person doesn't know what they're talking about, and vice versa, or it disproves the Bible.
Right, absolutely. Like in Harry Potter, it mentions the King's Cross Station, and we see King's Cross Station say, this proves Harry Potter is real, clearly.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's really true. For instance, again, I have this perspective on Genesis 2, that there's a lot of figurative language, and that would include, Eden. I don't think Eden was a real place. And one of my colleagues pushes back on me and says, oh, no, but you see, two of the rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, are real rivers. And the Gihon is too, even though the Gihon is not anywhere close to the Tigris and Euphrates and the Pishon. And I go, no, you don't. The technical term for what we're talking about is mimesis, literary mimesis, that when a fiction writer like J.K. Rowling writes Harry Potter, she doesn't create, all the locations or everything like that. She utilizes real places and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be the question, is like, where does that, in the case of something like the Exodus, that would be the question, is when we look at the archaeology combined with the extra biblical accounts, are there any, and looking at, is there any, because if, depending on what your account of the story is, if there is 600,000 Jews that left the Egyptian area, and they would probably leave like bones or something in between there, right?
Right. Yeah. So, we could get in, there is no direct evidence of the Exodus to cut to the chase. I think there are reasons why there aren't direct evidence. I also am skeptical that there were 600,000 plus Israelites. But it's plus because it's only the men that are counted.
Yeah.
Usually people who take a really conservative view on it will say 2 to 3 million people. And so there was something else I was going to say, but you'll probably come back to me a little bit later. So yeah, we have to read the text closely. We also need to be aware that there is no direct Egyptian evidence. We also have to be aware that there are some interesting, from our historical perspective at least, ambiguities in the text, since the
like the Red Sea and the Reed Sea.
Well, that's one of them, but I'm even thinking in terms of the way the text is presented in terms of never mentioning the Pharaoh's name. So there's a debate over, even if it is historical, when did it take place? So there are arguments to be made for, say, the 15th century BC, and there are other arguments to be made for the 13th century BC, among those who think that it's historical. So there are interpretive questions on the Bible side, as well as on the archaeology side. No, I know what I was going to get at earlier. Well, let me put it this way, that we know from later post-Exodus reflections on the Exodus that the psalmists, for instance, and others, they thought the Exodus actually happened, because they're using it as kind of a paradigm for their own potential rescue. Mm-hmm. So a psalm like Psalm 77, where the psalmist starts out talking about how horrible his life is and he can't sleep and God's not very good to him or to his people. But at the end, he starts reflecting on the Exodus as a kind of paradigm for his own potential rescue. So I think a psalm like that helps us understand that later Israel certainly thought of the Exodus as an event, and not just as an event, but as their kind of defining event. That is, the Exodus is that event that sort of established their status as a nation, So that was to be a priestly nation to the rest of the nations, as it says in Exodus 19. So that's why I find myself, not accepting some of my colleagues' arguments that the Exodus is a good story or a parable. And it's very analogous for those of us who put our trust in Jesus and think that the resurrection happened. It's very analogous to that whole situation, because there's of course no direct evidence of the resurrection either. And indeed, for both the Exodus and the resurrection, unless you buy the biblical worldview, there's no way you can convince another person who may be an atheist that these things happened, because as David Hume, I believe, said, any explanation for the resurrection besides it actually having happened, mass hysteria or whatever, because from his more empiricist, materialist viewpoint, there's no way that the supernatural elements of these biblical stories would make any sense.
Right,
which is
a violation of the laws of nature is the least plausible explanation.
Yeah, right. So, so that's why I think I told you when we were having some initial discussions, I'm not an apologist. I don't think, though I'm very happy to talk about the Exodus and why I think it happened. I don't think there are, as one famous, you may know this, one famous lay kind of popular apologetics book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. The title, I said something critical about that book in one of my books, and I got a very nice response from the author, Josh McDowell's son, who himself is a philosopher, saying that that's not really what he and his father were doing, but the title sure makes it sound like, if you just would listen to the evidence, then any reasonable person would simply accept Christianity. And I personally don't think you can be reasoned into the kingdom of God. Though on the other hand, I also don't think that Christianity is unreasonable. But it also, of course, depends on one's worldview.
Oh yeah, for sure. I can totally understand the difficulty in trying to pick a title that gets people's attention so they sell books, and then having that title actually correspond to what you're saying is like iffy area when writing books. So you mentioned the parallels between the Exodus story and later Jewish lives. I've heard like Israel Finkelstein talking about how that applied to King Josiah and how he wanted to reconquer the territories of the north, and then so he was using, which parallels to when the Bible was written, and so it could be the fact that the story of the Exodus was meant to parallel his story and to like fortify his people and to make them confident that he's going to win. It's kind of like war propaganda. And there's lots of different parallels between those two situations, like how the Israel's left their land from a foreign country and they were exiled, and they came back to their homeland. On the way back, they had returnees cross a dangerous desert. They had homeland evoked conflicts with the local population. They were returning to the promised land, and the leaders took measures of how to interact with the locals. There's lots and lots of parallels. And so that seems like it could just be like the Exodus story was kind of like a war propaganda kind of a thing at that time period in order to bolster the confidence of the people. And that seems to be like that parallel could actually, instead of like, as you mentioned earlier, it could be evidence that it was real and it was an actual event that they believed in, or it could also be something that motivated them and that's why they believed in it at the time.
Yeah, I had something different from what Finkelstein is arguing there. When I made that comment, then I'll come back and comment on Finkelstein's idea. What I simply meant was, as another very excellent Jewish scholar, Richard Elliott Friedman, said in his recent book on the Exodus, and he's a pretty, he's not a fundamentalist Jew or Christian or anything, but he doesn't think that the Exodus happened exactly as it was described there. But he said, how can you explain the existence of Israel unless there was something like this that happened to them? And also, isn't it interesting that most nations say Rome has a more kind of victorious origin story, whereas this is different, particularly from ancient origin stories. So it's an interesting argument that Friedman makes. And what I was saying was that's another interesting question about the church. I mean, how do you explain the rapid growth and the courage of the early Christians unless there was some motivating event? So, and that the analogy with the resurrection, there's no question, but there are echoes of the Exodus, not just at the time of the 7th century, as Finkelstein said, but at other times as well. But it can work both ways. Either, they're retrojecting something back into the past, or else they're shaping the presentation of that later time period in the light of the Exodus story. And there's no question but that, in 8th century prophets like Isaiah, Hosea, they're talking about the Exodus as a future event. They're saying, there's going to be another Exodus. And you could see that kind of Exodus language also in the book of Ezra when they're returning from the captivity. And you can also see it in the Gospels. I mean, Jesus' whole life is kind of patterned on the Exodus. His being baptized in the Jordan River is analogous to, and I can expound on this if you want me to, but it's analogous to the Israelites crossing the sea. Afterwards, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, where he experiences the same 3 temptations as Israel did in the wilderness, except that he resists them. And he quotes the book of Deuteronomy all 3 times, which is the book where Moses is telling the second generation not to sin like they did in the wilderness. And it goes on, then he goes on a mountain and gives the Sermon on the Mount, which is a reflection on the law, which is equivalent to Mount Sinai, and on and on and on, all the way to the crucifixion, which happens before the Passover. And that's why Paul can say in 2 Corinthians 5, Jesus is our Passover lamb. And now actually right now, this morning, I'm finishing up a commentary on Revelation, and I'm writing on all the echoes of the book of Exodus in the book of Revelation as well. So you get these kind of echoes or intertextual plays.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But isn't that kind of a common factor, especially in historical writing, to make like legendary stories kind of fit your current narrative and project them into the future and say they're going to happen again, to try and create like a archetype of patterns in order, especially because it's emotionally engaging to people. Like we see it in stories today, the same kind of a pattern.
Good question. Yeah. There's no question about it. Of course, it doesn't have to be legendary for it to have that same effect, so
right, like Hercules is hypothesized to have a real like strong guy that's got embellished over time.
There's no question that there is, historical events can have mythological functions as well. So this whole relationship between history and myth, even though everybody thinks myth, even, are just made up stories, but they're typically grounded in some type of reality as well. It doesn't have to be historical.
Oh, absolutely. So that's the big question is how do we tell which one of these interpretations is more plausible? Like what is the criteria we're using to say that the interpretation is based off of an actual historical event is more reasonable than like Finkelstein's interpretation that it's written to mirror current events and just written about the past?
I mean, that is the issue. And again, I take my perspective from the later biblical appropriations of it, and then ask the question, even though I can't prove it historically, certainly not in a broad secular environment where, historical critical methodology, it very, and for reasons I understand, will preclude any appeal to the supernatural. So if again, there's anything supernatural, it's automatically not under suspicion, but just simply not accepted. And so, and I understand that, if somebody doesn't have a view of the universe that extends beyond the material, then you can't. But as somebody who thinks, that sort of, I do take the kind of innocent until proven guilty rather than the guilty until proven innocent approach.
Which one's the innocent in this case?
Well, I mean, innocent in the sense of the biblical authors presenting an authentic perspective on it. And if you say, no, it's not, then you're saying they're guilty of misrepresentation. But then, I don't end the discussion there. I then ask, even though you can't prove it, there's no direct evidence, is there indirect evidence? Is it plausible? And to me, it's plausible. Even though, as I say, there are lots of questions that are open-ended because of the questions related to the interpretation of the Bible itself. There are certain things that are clear that it's saying and certain things that aren't clear that it's saying, including when it happened. And then the same thing's true with, say, archaeological evidence, which is very selective in and of itself, but also it's necessary to interpret it. So, for instance, why don't we have any references to the Israelites in Egypt? Well, I wish in one sense that we did. It would make things a lot simpler. But on the other hand, I think that it's mimicking. I think when you look what we have from Egypt, we don't have accounts of their humiliating defeats, for instance. Most of the material that we get from Egypt are things that you find on pyramid walls and obelisks and things like that. And we don't, and so we don't have a lot of negative stories about that. Now we do learn about some of their defeats. And I had an interesting discussion with one of my colleagues about this, who pointed that out. He goes, well, we know that they were defeated in the 16th century by the, I'm having a senior moment, but there were a group of West Semites who came in and defeated them in the 16th century. And there was another defeat that they had that we do know from the Egyptian records. But I pointed out to him that we know about them because Egypt eventually expelled them and defeated them. We don't have, it's pretty typical. As a matter of fact,
it's like the Hyksos or something, right?
Hyksos. Yeah, Hyksos. Thank you. Senior moment. Okay. So, it's the Hyksos. And that's pretty typical of all ancient Near Eastern people, except for what we have from Israel. And that might be because we don't have from Israel the literary products directly, say, from the court for the most part. They're kind of prophetic, not in the sense of talking about the future, but gives us a prophetic or theological perspective on the history. But it's, so I think that's reasonable. Why doesn't it mention the Pharaoh's name? Well, probably, as one of my colleagues, Jim Hoffmeyer, who's an Egyptologist, says, because that was the Egyptian practice as well. You never mention the name of an adversary in order to sort of erase their memory from history. And then, you look, I mean, the one thing 95% of all scholars will agree about is that Israel's in the land by the late 13th century BC. So you have this Israel stela or Merneptah stela that mentions where this son of Ramesses II, who's now Pharaoh, does a raiding campaign into Canaan and comes away and says, among other entities within Israel, it says Israel's seed was no more, which is again an example of battle account hyperbole, because Israel did survive. Now they're 5%, and that might include Israel Finkelstein, who are the most skeptical of Israel's history. There's a group of scholars that are commonly referred to as minimalists, and they take an extremely skeptical view, and it's a view that fewer and fewer people have been taking. It was very popular in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and has since kind of dissipated. So they're kind of the fundamentalists of the left, whereas we also have fundamentalists of the right.
Right, because I've definitely heard stories that there were definitely groups of Jews that left Egypt, but usually in the estimates of like a few thousand at the most.
Yeah, and I think that's possible. I mean, I think that that again, there are technical arguments for thinking that that number of 600 and some thousand isn't the actual number. I mean, one thing, and I can't give you the text, sorry, right off the top of my head, but there's a number in the book of Numbers that talk about the number of firstborn in Israel that left Egypt, which is way too small for it to sustain that many people. And then there are questions about the transmission of numbers throughout history. There's also the possibility of hyperbole again.
Yeah, and if we can look at, we have estimates of the population from current like sociological data, and if the numbers were correct, it's essentially like over half the population of Egypt at the time period.
Exactly. And the other thing that is interesting to think about is there are hints in the Bible that a lot of Canaanites came over to the Israelite side once they got there. So it might be that a much lower number of Israelites in the hundreds or low thousands were able to leave Egypt, go into Canaan, and and also sort of. And one of the interesting things, and Finkelstein talks about this, though he has a different interpretation than William Dever, is that in the 12th century BC, you have this interesting archaeological phenomenon, which is that the major Canaanite cities on the coast begin to crumble, while these small villages, there are about 300 small village towns in the highlands that suddenly appear. And what is often pointed out as notable is they all share a similar type of technology of olive tree terracing and plaster lined cistern, and a notable absence of pig bones, which a lot of people take as an indication that these people are observing some type of food law that is similar to what we read about in the Bible.
Oh yeah, sure. I've seen that there was work done that showed that the growth of the Israeli nation was actually a long cyclic process, and that it doesn't really seem to fit the conquering of Canaan narrative that it just happened overnight kind of a thing.
Well, except that the Bible's pretty clear that, well, it does. Joshua 1 through 12 describes this probably 5-year period where Joshua defeats the city of Jericho, then the city of Ai, then the Gibeonite coalition, deceive him, so it cuts off kind of the center. And then the tribes, the groups in the south all ally together. They leave their walled cities, and Joshua defeats them on the open battlefield. And then the same thing happens in the north. And as I said earlier, Joshua 1 through 12, it does sound hyperbolic, particularly if you read Joshua 12. It makes it sound like all of Canaan was defeated. But you turn to Joshua 13, then you start reading about the land allotment and giving the various tribes different parts of, so Judah. And it says, this is Judah's territory. But then it goes, but here's the part that they didn't take. And they do that for all the tribes. Turns out at the end of the chapter that they actually occupy much less than 40% of the land. And it's not until the time of David. This is David's big significance. He's the one who finally finishes the conquest. He's kind of the conquest completer. And that, of course, is what, it depends on when you date the Exodus, 200, 300, 400 years later. So, so Joshua 1 through 12 does present a kind of hyperbolic perspective. And I think it's sort of a celebration text in the sense of the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise of the land.
Yeah, I think that totally agrees with Finkelstein's interpretation. He says that the Joshua story was more hyperbolic and referencing more of the David stuff.
Yeah. So, except I think it's hyperbolic, though there were battles at that time and there was a Joshua, and I don't think Finkelstein would go that far.
Yeah, for sure. I think he just says there were just a bunch of settlements and they were coming in through just settling, and then the growth of the population eventually led to the David and his conquering. Right.
Yeah. So I have a great deal of respect for Finkelstein. I mean, he's a brilliant scholar. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned the supernatural in Hume. Like, my interpretation isn't necessarily that. I don't think most people take the Humean approach. We just reject supernatural out of hand. I think it's more like a kind of inductive approach. Like, if we see a footprint in the snow or whatever, a hoof print in the snow, we tend to think it's probably going to be a horse, since we already have evidence of horses, rather than invoking something new with no evidence. So I think from what I've read of Mike Licona, where he says most historians and biblical scholars hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity. Mingham quotes a bunch of secular scholars. It seems to be the interpretation is that until we can show some kind of independent evidence of miracles or magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, any of those examples, then those can't be invoked to explain something in history, because it would be more plausible that something that we already know existing would be a better explanation. Like same with the story of Romulus and Remus.
And that philosophical idea is what informs what I was calling the historical critical method within biblical studies. A guy named Troeltsch, developed various criteria for judging something either historical or not.
Do you have what paper specifically, or how to spell his name? I want to look that up.
It's hard. It's one of those German names with a Troelschch. There might be, it's TRO, maybe ELSCH. Hans Troeltsch. And I mean, if you're interested, email me afterwards. I'll actually send you, if I can find it, an electronic form of a chapter I wrote, which interacts with and critiques the historical critical method and talks about it.
Awesome, definitely. And it's called the historical critical method.
Well, what the historical critical method is a certain type of approach to the biblical text that develops out of Troeltsch's thinking about history. He didn't so much develop it as much as influence a certain strand of biblical scholarship, which sometimes, goes by the name higher criticism,
And do you have the title of his book where he specifically talks about this, or a paper he does?
I cite it in my article.
Okay, cool.
And so, he's like a 19th century figure who, and if you want to see a contemporary scholar who kind of particularly utilizes his approach, John Collins, J.J. Collins, at Yale, who wrote, I forget the title of it, something about Babel. And in that book, Collins sort of uses a book that I wrote on kind of the right of him, and then a minimalist on the left, and he kind of charts a middle way using this historical critical method.
And do you see the historical critical method as unreasonable or somehow faulty or a reason we shouldn't do it?
No, I don't. Again, I personally, since this, I think I have experience of the supernatural through prayer and feeling God's presence in my life. Though I can't point to things like the parting of the sea, I'm unwilling, in terms of my own understanding of the Bible, to go in that direction. Though on the other hand, one of the things that the historical critical, it's a very modernist approach, by the way. Not only more conservative Christians and Jews like myself resist it, but so do postmodern interpreters, who criticize the fact that you can be neutral on these issues, which is basically what historical criticism is doing. It's saying, if on the one hand, some scholars approach it from a religious supernatural perspective, how can they even talk to scholars who don't, and vice versa? So historical criticism for a long while was thought to be the only legitimate type of biblical scholarship. And so, but that marginalized not just religious readers of the Bible, but also feminist scholars and Marxist scholars and scholars who, queer scholars and so forth, different ideological scholarship.
Oh yeah, for sure. So what would be like I think you're using an inductive approach. You have experience of the supernatural, and then you're projecting that and saying, well, it's reasonable to based off of this that it could have also happened in the past in these cases with the Exodus.
Yeah, I mean, right. So again, the argument against supernatural is I don't have experience of that. And of the supernatural, so I can't allow it in my understanding of what the Bible's actually saying.
Yeah, I think I can understand that, because from my perspective, I would say I would want some kind of independent verification, like Craig Keener's miracles. If those could be verified, I think that would be great evidence, and we could say, so yeah, we can say that since miracles happen today, it's reasonable to infer they happened in the past. But without that independent objective evidence, just using my subjective experience of it, I'm not sure if I would see that as really strong.
Okay, that's fine.
I mean, would you disagree with that?
But I know Craig well. He's one of my good friends, and I've heard him lecture on miracles, and I, there's also something of, can you believe testimony of other people, and sometimes you can, other times you have. So when Craig tells me he's had experience of miracles, and Craig spends, I think, more time than I do, and other
pretty much more than anybody. Like him and Habermas.
Exactly. I'm not ready to doubt him. I've known him for 30, 40 years. And the Bible is that kind of testimony for some of us as well. That's why I said innocent till proven guilty.
Absolutely.
But also sometimes we misconstrue what the Bible's saying. Again, like we started our conversation off, if you think the Bible's teaching that the world was created in 6 24-hour days, the evidence against that is overwhelming. Or you think the world's only a few thousand years old, the evidence for that is overwhelming. That's when you have to you have to adopt, in my opinion, an unreasonable affirmation of what the Bible's teaching. And
do you think the same would apply to, for example, the 10 plagues and the parting of the sea?
It's a little bit difficult because it's different, at least as I'm thinking about it now. The two are different because on the one hand, things like the age of the earth and say biological evolution are things that can be studied by the scientific method. hard sciences, which, yield certain types of evidence. It uses certain types of evidence and yields certain types of conclusions. Whereas when it comes to the historical, it's a softer science, as I say, and so it'd be hard to prove or disprove in one way or the other, especially when it does involve something that we would call a miracle. Because I don't think the plagues could be described as natural events, for instance, as some people try to do.
Yeah, I definitely heard some stories about like just mold or some kind of algae turning the water red. But you'd say they're more supernatural kinds of things, not.
Well, I mean, if it was just that one, that might be possible. But when it talks about the death of the firstborn, it's a little hard to come up with a explanation that is that it has a natural. So there's a guy who wrote a book. I mean, he's obviously a brilliant guy in the sciences. He's a professor of physics at Cambridge. He's retired now, but he dabbles in biblical studies as well. And he wrote this argument, and he's not the first. There are a lot of them that talk about how all the plagues are natural events. That is, getting to the later ones, he said that the plague of hail damaged the crops before the plague of darkness. But once the darkness lifted, the Egyptians were starving and they had to go out and eat. But because their culture so prizes the firstborn in their families, they let the firstborn eat first, but there's such a lethal, fast-acting toxin that they all drop dead on the spot, and then nobody else. And those kind of explanations to me are much more fanciful than, say, it's a miracle, that in the sense that God intervened in some kind of direct way.
For sure, but don't you think that those are significant enough to leave enough of an impression that some other people probably would have wrote about them, even if it wasn't the Egyptians? Somebody would have noticed.
I don't know that that's the case. Really, I mean, we don't have a lot of records. It's not like we're dealing with an abundance of records from antiquity and from that time period, whether it's the 15th century or the 12th century BC. So that doesn't really bother me too much.
So how much of it do you think is historical? Like, how many people do you think left? Do you think was Moses actually like picked up off of the river and all of the burning bush and all of those things? Do you think how much of it is real versus?
Yeah, I do think much of it is real. And for instance, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on what are called fictional Akkadian autobiographies. That is Babylonian and Assyrian accounts that are written in the first person. It's interesting that one of those texts is called the Sargon birth legend. So I translated and comment on it. You may know it, about how baby Sargon, mother, who was a high priestess, for whatever reason couldn't keep him. So she put him in a reed basket on the Tigris River and floated down till he was discovered by an irrigation ditch digger and brought up. Now, on the one hand, I would say, is this a case of the Israelites ripping off some kind of ancient Near Eastern prototype? And I would say, no, this is, or it's equally likely that this is what women in certain situations did when they had children they couldn't keep but didn't want them to die. So they're commending them into the hands of their God. It's kind of the ancient equivalent of a mother taking her baby and putting her at the doorstep of a firehouse or a police station,
Church or whatever.
So
is that actually pretty like well accounted? Is that a common thing that happened during that time period?
Well, no, the fact that we have two accounts of it makes it common because, as I say, we don't have a lot of ancient literature. It's certainly notable. Matter of fact, when that text was first discovered in the 1890s in the British Museum, the guy who translated it apparently got so excited he started ripping his clothes off and dancing on the table in the basement of the British Museum. I've seen that account a couple times. So was that historically true? Sounds weird.
He's got to be pretty strong or pretty weak clothes or something.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, I think God could have chosen to reveal himself to Moses in that way. It certainly sort of fits in the pattern of the way that God would reveal himself to his people during this time and before, in the form of fire and also vegetation. So, so it's yeah. So I yeah.
Do you think the
So,
same thing would apply to the story of Gilgamesh and the flood, the world flood? That it,
well, I think I let me put it this way. I do think, and I've written on this with John Walton in a book called The Lost World of the Flood, which we co-authored. That yeah, I think both the Gilgamesh epic and the biblical account are reflecting a historical flood that happened in the past. I don't think they're copying each other necessarily. Or at least not directly. They may both be reflecting a third earlier source, and they're describing this flood, which I think was not a global flood, even though it's being described as a global hyperbolically in the Bible. Um, they're describing this flood and shaping it according to their different theologies.
yeah. So
Yeah.
another question I'd have is like if we took the same approach and say, for example, 1,000 years in the future, for example, we looked back at something like Harry Potter. Suppose J.K. Rowling, it was mistranslated and she thought it was a historical or something. And
Yeah.
if I had personal experiences of magic and other people had personal experiences of magic, could I look at the story and associate it with similar events at the time period and then come to the same conclusion about that being true? Um,
Yeah, I know where, yeah, I see where you're going with that. And sure, it's theoretically possible that
cool.
that's the case.
Yeah. So yeah, I tend to think, I don't think it's impossible what you're saying. It's definitely a possibility. I wouldn't discount it. But yeah, I think I tend to lean more towards the secular route for the mentioned, the secular historicity, critical history
Right,
method.
right, right.
So
Yeah. And I can understand why somebody might think in that way for sure.
yeah, but that was really interesting talking with you. We've gone going for about an hour. You said that was about your time frame. So
Yeah.
thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed the conversation and
Yeah. Me too, Tom. Thank you. And
absolutely.
best wishes to you.
Yep. Talk to you later.
Right.